This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
Oliver Hoover is long time, precedes me certainly, and many others, as an adjunct curator and editor at the American Numismatic Society. Best known, of course, for his work on Seleucid coinage and chronology, and on the late Hellenistic Near East and its coinages, particularly those of the Nabatean Kingdom, Hasmonean Israel. He co-authored the second part of Seleucid Coins, a comprehensive catalogue, and co-developed the wonderful new online corpus Seleucid Coins Online. He's currently working with Lucia on the Wichonki collection, and at the same time, because he has limitless energy and apparently 60 hours in every day, towards the completion of the extraordinary Handbook of Greek Coinage series, which is currently at an amazing 11 volumes. So at this point, I'm just going to hand over to the man who never sleeps, Oliver Hoover, who's going to speak to us about Philippica.
Thank you, Andy. Let me just see if I can share screen here. Okay, there we go. I come before you this morning, O conscript fathers, to offer my first Philippic on the Syrian tetradrams in the collection of our friend Rick Wichonki. That is, I come to discuss the tetradrams struck by the early Roman governors of Syria that evolved from the Hellenistic royal coinage of the late Seleucid king Philip Philadelphus, and a potential Roman surrogate coinage that preceded them. By the time Philip Philadelphus rose to power in the early 1st century BC, the glory days of the Seleucid kingdom had long faded away, leaving only 3 small king regions under regular direct Seleucid rule: parts of Cilicia Pedias, the environs of Antioch on the Orontes, and the territory of Damascus. On top of this very reduced nature, the kingdom was further weakened by the fact that each of its distinct regions was frequently controlled by opposing members of the Seleucid royal house, and they were prone to intra-dynastic warfare. Around 94 BC, Philip is first mentioned in the historical record as a brother of Seleucus IV, Antiochus XI, Demetrius III, and Antiochus XII. After the murder of Seleucus VI, in an uprising at Mopsus in Cilicia, Philip and Antiochus XI took revenge by destroying the city. It may be in reference to this act of revenge that Philip was known by the epithet Philadelphus, or brother-loving. Shortly thereafter, Antiochus XI was killed while trying to wrest Antioch from his cousin, Antiochus X, who had previously taken it from Seleucus VI. Philip appears to have controlled parts of Cilicia and northern Syria following the death of Antiochus XI, but only managed to claim Antioch in around 88-7 BC, after Antiochus X was killed in battle and Demetrius III was carried off by the Parthians. Philip subsequently reigned from Antioch and might have succeeded in seizing Damascus too, if the city had not already been handed over to the Nabatean king Aretas III after the death of Philip's sole remaining brother, Antiochus XII. Traditionally, the end of Philip's reign has been placed in 84-3 BC on the basis of the faulty chronology of Appian, but he may have survived on the throne as late as 76-5 BC. During his early reign in Cilicia, Philip Philadelphus struck silver tetradrachms to a reduced Attic standard of about 15.85 grams. That featured his diademed portrait on the obverse and the enthroned figure of Zeus Nicephorus on the reverse. However, after seizing Antioch, he undertook a monetary reform that introduced a much lighter standard of about 15.65 grams for Syrian coinage. This reform seems to have involved calling in and restriking the general pool of Syrian silver coinage on such a scale that it has made great rarities out of the coins of Antiochus XI and Demetrius III. Specimens of the second reign issues of Antiochus X are also surprisingly scarce for a reign of his some 5 years between 93-2 and 88 BC. Anything that managed to escape the recoinage disappeared through the workings of Gresham's law, as indicated by Syrian hoards deposited after Philip's reform at Antioch. These are almost exclusively composed of his new light tetradrachms and subsequent Roman imitations. Hoards including Philip's Antioch tetradrachms alongside earlier Seleucid issues are most commonly found beyond the borders of his kingdom, in Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Armenia, and Iran. After the death of Philip, the Seleucid kingdom continued to stagger on for another decade or so. Tigranes of Armenia occupied Damascus between 72-1 and 70-69 BC, and Antioch possibly a few years earlier. But following his expulsion by the Romans, Lucullus placed Antiochus XIII, a son of Antiochus X, on the throne in Antioch. Unfortunately, his reign was deeply unpopular, and he was briefly overthrown by Philip BARYPOUS, an obscure son of Philip Philadelphus. In 64 BC, when Pompey arrived to settle the affairs of the East, Antiochus XIII asked to be restored to power in Antioch. This request was flatly denied, and instead Pompey created a new Roman province of Syria. We know very little about the reign of Philip BARYPOUS beyond that he was swept to power at some point after 69 BC with the support of a faction in Antioch and an Arab chieftain named Aziz. A notice given by John Malalas indicates that in 67 BC, Philip BARYPOUS was visited in Antioch by Quintus Marcius Rex, the Roman proconsul of Cilicia for that year. According to Malalas, the purpose of Marcius's visit was to prescribe a tribute and to sponsor repairs to the palace and hippodrome of Antioch. It is unclear what precisely foros may mean at this time, since we have no evidence to suggest that the Seleucid kingdom was actually tributary to the Romans before provincialization in 64 BC. The tribute in question has been variously interpreted as a contribution to the Roman war against the Cilician pirates, or the price of Roman support for Philip's regime. He had, after all, usurped the place of Antiochus XIII, whose right to rule had been upheld by Lucullus. Regardless of the true nature of the tribute, it raises the question of what Philip BARYPOUS may have used to pay it. While he is likely to have had the use of tetradrachms produced during the reign of his father, it is tempting to suggest that he may have struck his own coins. An anomalous series of tetradrachms featuring the types and legends of Philip Philadelphus, but employing a slightly different portrait and a lower weight standard of about 15.45 grams, could potentially have been struck by Philip BARYPOUS. If so, it would conform to some degree with the parameters for identifying Roman surrogate coinages already enumerated by Francois. This coinage was produced using 26 observed obverse dies and involved at least 10 distinct emissions indicated by differing control monograms. The apparent scale of production seems rather large for a late Seleucid king whose reign cannot have been longer than the 3 years between 68-7 and 65 BC. Antiochus XIII, on the other hand, who may have ruled for roughly the same number of years, between 69-8 and 68-7, as well as again in 65-4 BC, produced only 2 distinct emissions using 2 observed dies. If the anomalous Philip tetradrams were indeed struck by Philip BARYPOUS, one wonders whether this could be a unique case of too big to be royal, and raises the potential that the coinage was actually struck to meet Roman military needs. This possibility is reinforced by the fact that this coinage does not appear to have regularly circulated in Syria, like the lifetime issues of Philip Philadelphus. A single specimen of SC 2487A occurs in the Aleppo 1950 hoard, which otherwise consisted entirely of pseudo-Philips of Roman Syria. While the only known hoard to contain SC 2488 is Sarnakunk 1945, which was uncovered in Armenia. Other examples of the anomalous issue may have been included among the unidentified Philip tetradrams in several hoards uncovered in Mesopotamia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Iran, but this is uncertain. Nevertheless, the Sarnakunk hoard provenance is tantalizing. It may imply that rather than seeking support against pirates or demanding a bribe, Marcius Rex may have come to Syria in 67 BC to enlist the involvement of the Seleucid Mint of Antioch in financing the ongoing Third Mithridatic War. This saw a great deal of Roman campaigning in and around Armenia between 68 and 66 BC. Indeed, Marcius was supposed to use his legions in Cilicia to assist Lucullus against Tigranes in 67 BC, but he was dissuaded by his brother-in-law, Publius Clodius Pulcher, who had an axe to grind against the commander. However, after the army refused to obey Lucullus and full authority in the east was given to Pompey in 66 BC, Marcius vacated Cilicia, and the legions there were used along with the Lucullan legions to defeat the Armenian king in the same year. If the anomalous Philip tetradrams were struck in support of the Cilician legions, it might account not only for their unexpected scarcity in Syria, but also their presence in Armenia. Although Antiochus XIII had struck his own tetradrams during his brief rule at Antioch, these were not produced on anything close to the scale of Philip Philadelphus's recoined tetradrams. Thus, when the Roman administration was established in Syria, it was Philip tetradrams that served as virtually the only circulating silver coinage in the region. The monetary situation in the Seleucid kingdom at the moment of provincialization was very similar to that of the Attalid kingdom when it was bequeathed to the Romans in 133 BC and subsequently became the province of Asia. There, several decades earlier, the largely Attic weight circulating silver in the kingdom began to be recoined by Eumenes II as lighter CISTOPHORIC tetradrams. The CISTOPHORI, named after the serpent-filled Cista Mystica used as their standard obverse type, were struck to a standard of about 12.75 grams, meaning that the Attalids made a profit of about an entire drachma every time they recoined an Attic weight tetradrachm. This is gross robbery compared to Philip's Syrian reform, which netted him only 1 hemiobol for every recoined tetradrachm. Nevertheless, the end result was the same. When the Romans took possession of the Attalid kingdom, the circulating silver coinage consisted almost entirely of cistophory. In both the province of Syria and the province of Asia, the Romans appear to have taken no action to introduce the denarius, but instead made use of the pre-existing currency systems and involved themselves in their continued production. Lucia has recently shown that this Roman involvement is already very much evident in the late CISTOPHORIC coinages produced at the time of the First Mithridatic War. This involvement became explicit in 58 BC when Titus Ampius Balbus assumed his office as proconsular governor of Asia and struck the first of the so-called later Republican cistophori. These new issues continued the traditional cistophoric types and controls, but also included the name of the governor in Latin. One wonders whether the idea for adding the name of the governor to cistophory at this time was somehow inspired by the bronze coinages struck between 6160 and 59.8 BC, bearing the transliterated Greek name of Gaius Papirius Carbo, the proconsular governor of Bithynia et Pontus. Although isolated earlier examples of cistophory signed by Roman commanders and governors are known, such as the famous emission naming Gaius Flavius Fimbria in 85 BC and an Ephesian issue of Gaius Atinius in 122-121. In 57 BC, Balbus's authority was prorogued and he was transferred to the province of Cilicia, where he also struck cistophory bearing his name at the mint of Laodicea on the Lycus. At the same time, Aulus Gabinius, the former legate of Pompey, took office as the first proconsular governor of Syria and proceeded to take a page right out of Balbus's cistophoric handbook. In Syria, Gabinius began to supplement the pool of circulating Philip Philadelphus tetradrachms with new issues that reproduced the types and titles of the dead Seleucid king, but which added a monogram of his name in Greek, which you should be able to see here. These new issues, in the name of Philip Philadelphus, are regularly known as pseudo-PHILIPS. The discussion in RPC 1 suggests that Gabinius's decision to continue Philip Philadelphus's types and legends may have been partially influenced by a Roman understanding of Philip BARYPOUS rather than Antiochus XIII as the last legitimate Seleucid king. However, this view does not seem to fully appreciate the virtual totality of the earlier recoinage under Philip Philadelphus, which left no other model for Gabinius to use for a regional Syrian coinage. In the same way, convenience, established acceptability, and the massive pool of cistophory struck in earlier periods seem to have been the motivating factors behind the retention of the traditional cistophoric weight standard and typology for the later Republican cistophory rather than any sort of political consideration. Like Gabinius, the governors of Syria who immediately followed him, Marcus Licinius Crassus from 55 to 53 BC, and Gaius Cassius Longinus from 53 to 51 BC, also struck pseudo-PHILIPS signed with their own monograms in Greek. However, after the issue bearing the monogram of Cassius, no further pseudo-PHILIPS were signed by Roman governors. Shortly thereafter, in 49 BC, the later Republican cistophory also came to an end in Asia, with a substantial Pergamene issue naming the rapacious Q. Metellus Pius Scipio. The last issue in the province of Cilicia had been struck under Marcus Tullius Cicero between 51 and 50 BC. The closeness in time between the beginning and end of the signed Pseudo-PHILIPS in Syria and the later Republican CISTOPHORIC in Asia and Cilicia almost gives the impression of a conscious policy of Roman magistrates identifying themselves on the coinage in these provinces in the period between 59-8 and 49 BC. Such a policy probably would have been tied directly to Pompey's eastern settlement, which is usually considered to have been ratified in the face of great opposition through the assistance of Julius Caesar in 59 BC. Perhaps not coincidentally, this apparent provincial coin policy seems to have collapsed at the very same time that the alliance between Caesar and Pompey fell apart. In 50 BC, Caesar's term as proconsular governor of Gaul and Illyricum came to an end, and Pompey, together with the Senate, demanded that he disband his army and return to Rome. Caesar's response, of course, was to cross the Rubicon and embark on the civil war that would make him dictator. The experiment of the later Republican CISTOPHORIC and the signed Pseudo-PHILIPS was not repeated. But 4 years after the emissions of Cassius, Pseudo-PHILIP production resumed at Antioch in a slightly different form. While the new tetradrams retained the traditional types and legend of Philip Philadelphus, they did not bear the monogram of the Syrian governor, but rather the monogrammatic ethnic of the Antiochenes, visible here. This use of the city ethnic was predicated on a grant of autonomy to Antioch made by Caesar in April 47 BC, which seems to be celebrated on what appears to be the very first issue of the new Pseudo-PHILIPS. It's notable for the monograms, which you can sort of see here. Here's ANT for Antioch, and here's AUT for autonomous. Caesar, as the source of Antioch's freedom, was advertised on the new Pseudo-PHILIPS through the addition of a date in the exurg, and you can see delta here for year 4. This date was based on a so-called Caesarian era, which counted from 49-8 BC, the year of Caesar's victory over Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus. Although there is a noticeable gap in production between 38-7 and 31-0 BC, the new Caesarean dated Pseudo-PHILIPS continued to be struck until 1413 BC. It has been suggested that this gap was filled by the famous portrait tetradrams of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, which unfortunately carry no clear date, but attribution of this series to Antioch remains open to dispute. At last, the Pseudo-PHILIPS were swept away by the Augustan monetary reform at Antioch in 5 BC. But even then, it was still very difficult to fully escape the old model of Philip Philadelphus and put to rest the ghost of the defunct Seleucid Empire that it represented. The first new issues of 5 BC feature the bare head of Augustus on the obverse, with a very Seleucid-looking fillet border. The reverse also depicts the old seated Zeus type, including the wingless Nike and the frozen control. There. That would have been familiar to Philip in the early 1st century BC. While the legends retain the same style as the earlier tetradrams, they now name Caesar son of the god, rather than the expected King Philip Epiphanes Philadelphus. Later in 5 BC, new tetradrams were produced at Antioch with the laureate portrait of Augustus on the obverse and an entirely new reverse depicting the Tyche of Antioch. But even then, a tiny remnant of the late Pseudo-PHILIPS remained in the form of the obverse fillet border as well as the civic monogram in the right field. This monogram finally disappeared on the Antiochene coins of Tiberius. And yet, at a secondary Syrian mint that has not yet been identified, tetradrams continue to be struck for Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, and Claudius, with a Zeus Nicephorus reverse that is little more than a modified and updated version of the pseudo-Philip type, and which also features the old fillet border on the obverse. The shadow of Philip Philadelphus was long indeed. In 2013, Rick purchased from the same dealer 2 Philip tetradrams, which were probably found together. His motivation for buying them was provided by the monogram in the exurg here, which he suspected might name Aulus Gabinius, and would make the coins rare variants of the more usual tetradrams featuring the monogram of the governor in the left field here. Unfortunately, as it turns out, by the time that Rick was obtaining these tetradrams as potential new coins of Roman Syria, they had actually been part of the literature on lifetime issues of Philip Philadelphus for some years. They were known to Ernest Babylon and to Edward Newell, and indeed, prior to Rick's generous gift, the only specimen in the ANS collection was a piece that had previously belonged to Newell. Newell had believed that the coins were struck during the lifetime of Philip Philadelphus, but was uncertain about the attribution to Antioch. His questioning was taken further in the second part of Seleucid Coins, a comprehensive catalog, where the tetradrams were also attributed to the lifetime of the late Seleucid king, but given to an uncertain Cilician mint. The view that the coins in question were the product of a mint other than Antioch seems very solid in light of their differences in style and control conventions with those of lifetime issues of Philip Philadelphus, and the pseudo-Philips certainly struck at the Syrian metropolis. As we have seen, lifetime Philips produced at Antioch regularly feature a primary control in the outer left field, consisting of the letter nu or phi above alpha, a frozen monogram under the throne, and a secondary control in the inner left field, usually consisting of a single Greek letter, or more rarely, a very simple monogram. The pseudo-Philips omit the outer left field control, which was frequently struck off flan on the lifetime issues to begin with, but retain the frozen control and a monogram in the inner left field, as well as a date in the exurg on the issues dated according to the Caesarean era. Rick's specimens of SC 2461.1, however, lack the lifetime Antiochene outer field primary control and retain the frozen throne control. They also feature a monogram in the exurg and an inner left field that is filled up with abbreviated Greek names. His coins are also notable for their different artistic style, which is especially visible in the treatment of Nike held by Zeus on the reverse. On lifetime Philips and pseudo-Philips of Antioch, her wing is generally omitted due to the closeness of the type to the surrounding legend, but it is regularly visible on examples of SC 2461.1. If Antioch is ruled out as the issuing mint for Rick's coins, as is strongly suggested by these differences in style and control conventions, it seems difficult to salvage the idea that the issue might have been struck under Gabinius. And likewise, if the Cilician attribution proposed in Seleucid Coins Part 2 is correct, any potential association with Gabinius becomes even more difficult, since during his tenure in Syria, Balbus and Publius Cornelius Lentulus were governing Cilicia. If SC 2461.1 seems out of place in the 50s BC in either Roman Syria or Cilicia, it also seems rather out of place in the period between 887 BC and the end of the Seleucid kingdom in 64 BC. The limited hoard evidence suggests that this issue did not circulate alongside Philadelphus tetradrachms that are more securely attributable to Antioch or Cilicia during the king's lifetime. The Commerce 2003 hoard included only one example of 2461.1, as well as specimens of two apparently related series, SC 2461.2 and SC 2461.3. There is likewise no indication that SC 2461.2 circulated with known lifetime issues of Philadelphus. On the other hand, SC 2461.3 appears in the Anatolia 1987 hoard along with SC 2461.5. Related issues from the same mint, and SC 2462, and unattributed issue thought to be of Cilician origin. One example of SC 2461.3 also occurred in the Syria 1991 hoard in association with 3 lifetime Philips of Antioch and 1 pseudo-Philip with an illegible Caesarean era date. A preliminary metrological study of SC 2461.1 and the additional varieties of SC 2461 attributed to the same mint in Seleucid coins Part 2 may perhaps explain why these coins did not generally circulate with the lifetime Philips or with the pseudo-Philips signed by Roman governors. While the mode for the entirety of SC 2461 is given as between 15.51 and 15.60 grams in Seleucid coins Part 2, this is the case primarily for the SC 2461.6 variety, whereas 2461.1, 2461.2, and 2461.3, the 3 series found together in the Commerce 2003 hoard, seem to be significantly lighter. The modes of 2461.1 and 2461.2 hover around 14.60 grams, while that of SC 2461.3 is somewhat higher at around 15 grams. This higher weight may perhaps explain why SC 2461.3 occurs in the Anatolia 1987 hoard, which also contained 2461.6 and 2461.5, but not the lighter 2461.1 and 2. With the exception of 2461.6, all of these modes fall below the 15.85 gram mode for lifetime Philip tetradrachms struck in Cilicia between 94 and 88 BC, and below that of 15.61 to 15.65 grams for lifetime issues struck at Antioch following Philip's reforms in 88-7 BC. Interestingly, the mode of 2461.3 falls to about 15 grams, a weight standard that is comparable with the pseudo-Philips produced at Antioch in the period 3130 to 1716 BC. The modes of 2461.2 and our primary interest, 2461.1, are significantly lower, hovering around 14.6 grams, which seems to indicate a standard lower even than the post-Actian pseudo-Philips, and they are totally incompatible with earlier periods. Thus, it is tempting to suggest that while Rick may have been mistaken in thinking that 2461.1 was a possible issue of Gabinius, he may not have been wrong to sense that this issue was struck in the early Roman provincial period that he loved so much. Unfortunately, while metrology and the limited hoard record seem to point in the direction of SC 2461.1 as a late posthumous Philip issue, possibly struck in the Augustan period, it is far from clear where it was struck. As we have seen, Antioch must be ruled out entirely, and a mint in Cilicia seems rather improbable at such a late date. It has been noted that the coinage of Roman Antioch seems not to have played a major role in Cilicia, and therefore there is little reason to seek a mint for SC 2461.1 there. As pseudo-Philips of Antioch signed by Roman governors or bearing Caesarean-era dates only circulated regularly in Syria, and we know that the related issue SC 2461.3 was found with an Antiochene pseudo-Philip in a Syrian context, it seems reasonable to conclude that SC 2461.1 and the other varieties of 2461 were most likely struck somewhere else in northern Syria. In keeping with the Ciceronian theme with which I introduced this talk, it is tempting to end by voicing outrage against the times and the customs. But that would be rather more Catilinarian than Philippic. So instead, I will conclude my first Philippic with the hope that the preceding discussion, inspired and in large part illustrated by the coins from Rick's collection at the ANS, has underlined the important, but perhaps sometimes underappreciated, role played by the pseudo-Philips in Syria. These tetradrams were not only vital in bridging the transition from Seleucid kingdom to Roman province, but their development also reflects the application of Roman policies growing out of earlier experience in the province of Asia. At the same time that the pseudo-Philips and the potential surrogate Philips illustrate the Roman impact on Syrian coinage, they are also emblematic of the influence that the Hellenistic model provided by Philip Philadelphus had on the attempt to create a Roman provincial coinage for Syria. Hopefully, none of the conclusions reached in this Philippic are sufficient to land me unpleasantly on the rostra. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Fascinating trot through the late Seleucid and early Roman Syrian periods, and again showing us just how broad, but also how detailed simultaneously Rick's interests were, and he could spot an interesting issue a mile away. Just to pick up on your last point, and while people, and just to reiterate to people, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A. Do not raise your hand or put it in the chat. One question stroke observation, I suppose, is one that brings us back to the question Noah was asking earlier, which is the one about, as it were, the degree to which this Roman sort of discretion, to a certain extent, may look invisible to us, but what was it? Did it have a sort of interventionist aspect in some sense? I guess another way in which you could say that the Roman decision to issue Philips had a Hellenistic model was not simply in the choice of the type they copied, but also in the decision to produce posthumous coinage, which is simply a continuation, let's say, of the use of the Alexander type by the Seleucid kings, for example. And this actually fits into a mode of monetary behavior which this world was used to. Would that be too overstated?
No, I don't think at all. This is something that was already going on for a long time, and in the a prime example in the Seleucid context are the Cappadocian and Antiochus VII issues. This is not a new thing. It may have been semi-new to the Romans, but the the Greek population was very familiar with this, I think.
Right. So, moving into our question and answers, we have a specific question from Laurent Schmidt. Laurent, well, greetings, Paris. Can we imagine an anonymous coinage between the years 63 to 57 in the name of Philip Philadelphus, not determined today, but perhaps imagined by Michel Prieur or Richard Macaulay's hypothesis?
Sorry, can we
Can you see the Q&A window?
Us. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what is being asked, because I've tried to show that there was an anonymous coinage in the name of Philadelphus in this period. So I'm not quite sure how to answer this.
The answer is yes.
Besides to say yes.
Laurent, you have permission to speak, I think. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, I ask this question because I am thinking that it's impossible that during this period between the 6 years between the Pompey and Gabinus, they have not been minting tetrahedrals. Because after we have a long serial of mints, of coins, except on Augustus' reign. And for this reason, it's perhaps possible that we have not found today coins who have been minting during this period, but not determinate. Michel Prieur was thinking that.
Yes, yeah, I apologize. I misread the dates in your question. I think it's very possible. There are a number of odd issues in Seleucid Coins Part 2 that don't always seem to fit into what you would expect for the lifetime or early posthumous Philip Philadelphus coinages, and it is possible that some of these should fall into this period.
Thank you very much.
So we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to try a variation now of Warren Estes' question earlier, I suppose, which I think applies potentially at 2 points at least to your presentation. One is with these 26 obverse dies worth of what are we going to call these surrogate Philips in the 60s potentially. You use the phrase enlist the help of the Seleucid Mint of Antioch. What does that mean? Does it mean that they also enlisted the support of the civic treasury, or is it simply them coming in with their own silver and saying, could you make us up a few coins? And a related second question would be for the later period, once we get into the provincial period, and we have these issues which have the supposedly the monogram of autonomous Antioch. Do we think this is the city itself minting silver, or is this again the Roman administration simply running its bullion through a production facility?
Well, to answer the first question, it's a little hard to know from what John Malala says, because at the same time that he says that Marcus Rex comes to impose a tribute, which is one would expect to be the cause for the coinage, he is also supposed to have funded the rebuilding of the hippodrome and fixed up the Seleucid palace. So it seems odd if he actually did those things. It seems odd that he'd be using money from somewhere else to pay for this rebuilding and then demand money from the king or from Antioch to make these coins. But at the same time, it seems kind of more Roman to come in and demand it. So it's difficult to know on the basis of the very scanty evidence that we have. Can you remind me of the second part of the question?
The autonomous, the so-called
yes,
autonomous later issues. Whose are they?
Well, I think that that Antioch monogram on the Roman issues, I think that's the same or very close to, when you have posthumous Alexanders, and there are city emblems in the corners. Is that, where is that source coming from is still the question. Is it always civic silver, or is the king demanding the coins, or where is that silver coming from always?
So this is an unknown still.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, let's leave it there. We can come back to that, I'm sure, if we want to.
Thank you for watching the American Numismatic Society's YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like our online resources, publication, and events, you can support the Society by becoming a member. And don't forget to check out our book and eBay stores. The links are below.